Hello, everyone. So first of all, welcome to this seminar. My name is Yuk Hui. It's my great pleasure to welcome all of you and also Professor Susanna Lindberg for this seminar today. And today, Susanna is going to give a talk titled Bernard Stiegler's Love of Music. And after the seminar, we are going to have a dialogue around the subject. So it was exactly through Bernard Stiegler that I met Susanna. I think it was 2019. So it's a great occasion to continue the discussion, and especially on a subject that is not very much explored. The subject of music in the thought of Stiegler. So I'm really looking forward to the seminar of Susanna. I'm going to briefly introduce Susanna, and then we're going to open the seminar. Susanna Lindberg is a professor of continental philosophy at the University of Leiden in the Netherlands. She's a specialist of German idealism, phenomenology, and contemporary French philosophy. In recent years, her research has carried on the question of technology. Her recent publications include Technics en philosophie, published by Les Éditions Eman, 2020, Le Monde, des faits, Lettres au monde, aujourd'hui, also published by Eman in 2016. And earlier in 2010, she published two books, Heidegger contre Hegel, les irréconciliables, and Entre Heidegger et Hegel, l'éclosion et vie de l'être, published by Lamartine, both in 2010. She also has edited several collected volumes, notably The Ethos of Digital Environment, Technology, Literary Theory, and Philosophy with Hannah Roine, forthcoming with a Rollage in 2021, this year. The End of the World with Matthias Cavalcante Subak, published by Roman and Littlefield 2017, and also Europe Beyond Universalism and Particularism with Sergei Pozorov and Mika Orgakangas, published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2014. So it's my great pleasure to welcome Susanna. So we are going to go straight away into the seminar, and then we are going to have a discussion together. So, Susanna, the stage is yours.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much. Thank you very much, Yuk, for having invited me here. I'm thrilled to be in Hong Kong without unfortunately being there anyway in person. One day I hope so. And thank you everybody for being present to this presentation. It's a pleasure. So I'm going to speak to you about Bernard Stiegler's aesthetics. I'm actually sort of finishing a project on him, on his work, with two works on aesthetics. This one on music and another one is on the way on cinema, which are his arts and technological arts as it comes. So Bernard Stiegler was neither a musician nor a musicologist. And he did not compose philosophy in a distinctly musical manner either. But still his life was tried to concrete musical institutions twice. In his youth, he was committed to jazz. In an interview with Jean-Jacques Berger and Jean Rochard, Stiegler tells how, prior to his prison sentence in 1978, he was a total jazz enthusiast and even had a jazz bar in Toulouse. I quote, "I had created a sort of a jazz bistro in order to be able to listen to music all the time. I received musicians. I was the DJ. I thought that my job was to make others discover music and to sell beer. I spent hours in record shops looking for good things to listen to. It was a period of my youth when I had a rigorous listening practice. Then I stopped." End of quote. Later, when his life was already dedicated to philosophy, he also collaborated with people like the philosopher musicologist Peter Shendy, the musicologist Nicolas Donin, and Laurent Bayle, who was the director of IRCAM. IRCAM is the Institut de Recherche et Coordination Acoustique Musique in Paris. Now, IRCAM, institution created by Pierre Boulez, is one of the world's most selective and sophisticated places of creation of what you call contemporary classical music. It's a wobbly oxymoron. It doesn't really translate its French equivalent, musique savante, which fits IRCAM better. In 2002, Stiegler was nominated as its director. In interviews made at the moment of his nomination, he tells that he was attracted to IRCAM because this institution was busy studying and inventing new musical technologies. Not only sound synthesis, but also sound analysis, new possibilities of digital technologies, including artificial intelligence and so on, in a context which could foster the needs of creation instead of commercial one. So it is a totally technological place. You don't get more technological in music in this world. Now, are the jazz bar and the laboratory of contemporary music just biographical coincidences, or symptoms of a fundamental musical experience with philosophical consequences? In reality, although it might not be so evident at first glance, music constitutes an originary impetus of Stiegler's philosophical thinking, equal in importance to the more visible, precisely, cinematographic and televisual themes, and I suggest much more emancipatory than them. Music has for Stiegler a fundamental philosophical role comparable to the role of writing for Derrida, to the extent that Stiegler even says in an interview titled Le Circuit du désir musical, that he has wanted to study in the domain of music the same question that Derrida had studied under the name of grammatology. And this is what I will study, this claim is what I will study in the following. I will present first the heuristic privilege that Stiegler accords to music because of its marked instrumental nature that distinguishes it among all arts. In the domain of music, the processes of instrumentalization not only has begun very early, but it is originarily manifest. Music is also the best possible illustration of Stiegler's core idea of interlacing of techniques and the time of consciousness. Secondly, I will show how the question of music structures Stiegler's diagnosis of the contemporary globalized society, interpreted as the epoch of the industrial production of affects. And finally, I will show how music gives ways of escaping the depressing standardization characteristic of this epoch. But first of all, on instrument and recording. The philosophical anthropology or existential analytic developed by Stiegler in Technics and Time 1 thinks human existence, who, in function of the technical objects, what. The philosophical starting point of this work is Stiegler's objection to Heidegger's reduction of the who-what relation to the relation between the Dasein and its equipment or utensil. One interesting counterexample to the interpretation of technical objects in terms of equipment is presented in an earlier article called La lutherie électronique et la main du pianiste, in which Stiegler shows that unlike the utensil, the musician's instrument is not a tool for something, it's not a means. It is the occasion of a specific instrumental practice, in which, I quote, the instrument is not submitted to a pre-constituted aim, but on the contrary constitutes it. The aim of an instrumental practice is informed by the instrument. The pianist manifestly invents herself, elle s'invente, in her tireless practice of the instrument. And this is how she invents her piano playing, s'y invente, endlessly, end of quote. The musical instrument is not a prosthesis of for overcoming an organic lack either. It is an instrument that is desirable because it opens a new world, although by doing so, it creates another kind of a lack, the default of an instrumental skill. Its sense emerges through a paradox of exteriorization, as Stiegler puts it. The instrument seems to be an exteriorization of the human interiority, but actually it only produces the interiority it presupposes. For example, the pianist expresses herself with the piano, but at the same time the piano forms the pianist's hands, memory, and musical judgment that the expression requires. In the third volume of Technics and Time, Stiegler complements the Heideggerian starting point of the first volume with a Kantian and Husserlian question of the structure of consciousness. Husserl's 1905 lectures of internal time consciousness turn out to be particularly important for him. In his interpretation, Husserl's example, that is a melody, as you know, is much more than just a possible example among others. The prototype of a purely temporal object that makes it possible for Husserl to articulate the structure of consciousness. This example also makes it possible for Stiegler to take his distance from Husserl by underlining the fundamentally technological character of all musical objects, including the melody, which turns out to be more complex than it sounds. Stiegler returns to his reading of Husserl's lectures of internal time consciousness in two important articles on music, Le Circuit du désir musical from 2004 and Les instruments de la musique du nous from 2008. In these texts, he revisits his reading of Husserl's idea of consciousness as a temporal flow from the point of view of music. As consciousness is, according to Husserl, always a consciousness of something, the temporality of consciousness comes forth when this something is itself temporal. And there is no better example of a purely temporal object than a piece of music, because it cannot be reduced to a discursive logos, nor to a visual spatial image, and yet it has a structured, finite identity. A melody is a phenomenon that only appears in its disappearance. It is pure passage that cannot be fixed without destroying its very phenomenality. And this is precisely why its correlate, the I, also appears as a pure, unstoppable passage. Husserl describes this flow in terms of primary and secondary retentions that Stiegler reinterprets and complements with his own idea of tertiary retentions. Primary retentions are whatever the consciousness retains in the flow of now, for example, a resounding note. The primary retention is not a punctual impression, like an instantaneous sound frequency. It already consists of two acts of consciousness. It's already a synthesis. Firstly, in order to appear as a note, the sound must refer to other sounds in relation to which it has a musical sense. For instance, a melodic, a harmonic, or a rhythmic function. An A is not really, or it's not only, a sound of 440 hertz of frequency. It is a certain interval from C, D, etc. According to Husserl, the A is not A if the previous notes are not still present in the A, although they have already passed. Secondly, the consciousness does not retain everything that is present in the now, but it selects meaningful elements of the now through the filter of its secondary retentions. Against Husserl, Stiegler poses that already the primary retention is selective. For example, it retains the note but ignores the noise coming from the next room. The secondary retention is a memory of earlier primary retentions that are conserved in the memory, not the past that is still present, but the past that is properly in the past. In the case of the melody, the secondary retentions constitute the typical features of the musical culture in which the melody is heard. For instance, in the Western musical culture that is strongly marked by tonality, there is a very strong expectation that a melody in C major ends in a C chord, instead of a chord based on B or E. The primary retentions filtered by secondary retentions give rise to expectations of what will follow, or pretensions. Like, for example, the expectation that a tonal melody in C major will end in a C major, even though the melody has not yet come to an end. Music is essentially pretension, that is to say expectation, says Stiegler. Stiegler underlines the difference between primary and secondary retentions by saying that primary retentions belong to perception, while secondary retentions belong to imagination and therefore to past proper. Nonetheless, only imagination gives sense to perception. You cannot really separate the two in action. To this Husserlian explication of the temporality of consciousness that you know very well, I think, Stiegler adds a new element, the tertiary retentions. In Technics and Time 3, he shows that the intervention of the secondary retention in the act of primary retention becomes obvious only thanks to the tertiary retentions. A tertiary retention is a technical object or a system. A phonographic disc, a musical instrument, a score, a recording, a book, whatever object that serves as a support of memory that can be transmitted from a generation to another, from an individual to another, or from a culture to another. As examples of the structure that Stiegler also calls epiphylogenetic memory, these tertiary retentions ingram experiences on supports that have some kind of materiality. Even digitalized memories are materialized. The material objectivity allows, on the one hand, the conservation of the experience much longer than conscious memory or even individual experience that has fallen into oblivion. On the other hand, it allows the sharing of the experience. With an instrument, a particular sound can be given from a person to another. With a score, a composition can be shared by a whole orchestra and by many orchestras from one place and time to other places and times. And with a recording, a particular interpretation of a given score can be shared by countless auditors. Stiegler underlines that our ears are not formed only by our personal listening experiences, but by the entire system of tertiary retentions that make up our musical culture. For example, the scores that we may or may not know and know how to read, but that remain indispensable elements of Western musical culture in this case. According to Stiegler, this threefold retentional structure constitutes the musical phenomenon perceptible as a melodic or temporal flow. In the event of perceiving a melody, the temporal flow of the melody coincides with the temporal flow of consciousness. The melody is audible in function of expectations of the consciousness. For the philosopher, it reveals the structure of the consciousness. But more than that, the melody communicates its structure as well as its unexpected features to the consciousness. For the listening consciousness adapts to the structure of the perception. In his article, Les instruments de la musique du Nos, Stiegler underlines that the consciousness's adaptation to music is so total because their structure is similar. And this has important affective, ethical, and political consequences that Stiegler has investigated in Symbolic Misery and in several articles. And now I'm going to political music, the political consequences of all of this. Now, the fact that music not only has a similar structure as the soul, but it can also give its form to the soul, accounts for the affective force of music. This affectivity can turn into a political force, as shown already by Plato, who imposed, as you know, a strict control of music in his Republic in order to regulate the way in which music forms souls. Like strong and courageous music forms strong and courageous souls, sly and dissolute music forms crooked citizens and should therefore be banned. Artists have always loathed the censorship recommended by Plato, but Stiegler actually follows Plato's fundamental intuition in his analysis of the political implications of the way in which music is used today in marketing. In Les Instruments de la musique du Nous, Stiegler explains music's ethical effects and therefore its political significance with a reference to the Greek understanding of ethos. Continuing his analysis of Husserl, but referring also to Bertrand Lorta-Jacob, Stiegler underlines that in music, one cannot separate the musical object from the subject who listens. And now I quote, "The musical object only presents itself as a subject, or more precisely as a listening, écoute. It is essentially listening. While listening can also be, and is very often, what gathers singular listeners into a listening we. I believe that this relation between the I and the we constitutes every musical experience. The music that resounds in my intimacy and that can only resonate in me as my intimacy is precisely the outside. I only hear it as something that resonates outside, as what comes from the outside to resonate in me, as what is always already outside of me and in this sense always forms the horizon of a we, being at the same time very intimate and radically exterior to me. I believe that this is also the structure of the ethical relation." End of quote. So the structure of music and structure of the ethical relation is the same. Changing over to Gilbert Simondon's vocabulary, Stiegler continues by explaining that all psychic individuation constituting an I, for instance, somebody speaks or writes or makes music, happens within a collective individuation that constitutes a we. Between us, we speak, we write, we make music in this way. Stiegler follows the motif that resurfaces regularly from Plato to Nietzsche when he describes the individuation of a we in terms of music. Like music, a collective identity cannot really be explained through a discursive logos or through a visible image, and yet it gives its form to the individuals. It can be a common experience, like a music that attunes a public, but it can be a common experience only because, before and independently of any real experience, it contributes to the secondary and tertiary retentions that filter and orient individual experiences like a stock of pre-individual experiences. It is not by chance that the same vocabulary of apparently irrational and nevertheless effective phenomena is used to describe both music and features and humors of collectivities, that is, affects, tonalities, harmonies, and rhythms. Especially Heidegger, by the way, uses these terms. Ethos and music, therefore, function in the same way. They constitute the most intimate intimacy of who I am, but they do this from an exteriority that is more distant than any objectivable, that is to say, ideal and discursive externality. But that comes from an inobjectivable outside. That would be le dehors in Rangel's sense. They do not tell what to think and what to do, but they prepare the soul to think and to act, or restrain itself from thinking and acting. Now, if the isomorphism between music and consciousness explains the effective force of music, what then makes the difference between ethical and totalitarian, individualizing and disindividualizing ethico-musical experience? In Symbolic Misery 2, Stiegler explains this difference in terms of the lac, that translates the défaut qu'il faut. If for Plato music, together with mathematics, that is consubstantial with it, is the spiritual discipline par excellence, because it expresses the transcendental affinity between consciousness and world, I quote, since Kant, we know that this affinity is only by default. Musical consciousness should be structured mathematically, like the musical world, but only through a lac, and this lac is unavoidable. C'est là le défaut là qu'il faut. This lac is what makes music ring out. The lac, as that which rings out as music itself, is the power of the siren song. End of quote. So, to put it very bluntly, the 20th century totalitarian and the 21st century hyper-industrial musical experiences suppress this lack by filling it overabundantly, whereas singular and therefore active musical and ethical experiences become possible when the lack is felt and desire emerges. In the modern world, the lack rises from the experience of the fishering of the world reflected in the fishering of the consciousness, says Stiegler, and this we hear in Schoenberg's music, according to him. Stiegler unfolds the general structure of the musical ethical experience by telling a history that starts from ancient Greece, develops through Western history, and becomes finally global. This history gets different, a brighter tonality, when told as a history of different ways of engramming, that is, writing music. And just a couple of words on this history. Stiegler tells that the oldest known instruments have something like 45,000 years, although our ancestors surely had musical instruments well before this. After all, there doesn't seem to be human societies without music. The more primitive the societies, primitive as it's said, the greater the function of music in the synchronization of consciences appears to have been. Think of working music, trance music, etc. The case of war music is also interesting, although Stiegler does not speak of it, as far as I know. Stiegler does not interpret the musical instrument as a tool, but as an engram. That is, as a kind of a writing that records the same sound and makes it reproducible. It can be an instrument of collective individualization, precisely because as writing, it makes repetition of the same sonority possible. And each repetition is already a beginning of a rhythm. An excellent example of the capacity of collective individualization provoked by a specific instrument would be the unique sound of the archaic Jewish instrument shofar, whose uncanny capacity of evoking an entire religious culture, as described by Theodor Reich, was powerfully analyzed by Philippe Lacoue-Labarthe in The Echo of the Subject. A wholly different musical engram is the musical notation that became the base of Western learned music since Guido d'Arezzo's invention of solmization, at the turn of the first millennium. But it is known that different techniques of notation do exist long before this and elsewhere than this as well. The score is a new way of producing secondary retentions. It does not conserve a sound. It conserves a work, and it makes the distinction between composer and interpreter possible. The passage from 19th to 20th century, marked by Wagner, Nietzsche, and Schoenberg, marks a particular crisis of European psyche, in which consciousness discovers itself incapable of harmony and unity, as reflected in the strange, dissonant musics of early 20th century. One could actually say that it accompanies the increasing crisis consciousness of nascent phenomenology at the time. Stiegler underlines that the musical revolution that he indexes particularly to Schoenberg and Bartók, and Adorno, of course, is contemporaneous with the invention of a new technology, the invention of the phonograph by Thomas Edison in 1877. The phonograph, like the photography and the cinema, the radio and the television, they all contribute to a new synthesis of time. But Stiegler finds the case of music particularly interesting because, unlike other industrial arts, music has a vast pre-machinic instrumental history, against which the specificity of the new epoch shows distinctively. The phonograph is an unprecedented kind of a tertiary retention, insofar as for the first time, it enables the absolutely identical repetition of a musical object. As Bartók realized already in 1938, and as Adorno developed in 1969, the machinic reproducibility of music is the new form of musical writing that leads to a genuine revolution in our relation to music. And this is why it allows the study of the chances of sensibility that accompany technological changes. On the one hand, it led to a certain loss of competencies because it became possible to relate to music without practicing it. One could listen without eyes to read the score and without hands to play it. But on the other hand, the phonograph brought music to a wider public than ever and created new practices of listening, or as Peter Schendi puts it, a more thoughtful auscultation of works. Using Schendi's terms, what the phonograph makes repeatable is not only an act of hearing, audition, but a repeatable listening, écoute. Not a simple perception, but an interpretation that enables analytic practices of listening and that can open towards new interpretations, arrangements, and appropriations of works. For Stiegler, an extraordinary example of what the phonograph made possible is the birth of jazz. In an article, Programme de l'improbable, court-circuit de l'inouï, he explains how Charlie Parker really had two instruments, the saxophone and the phonograph with discs. If the classical composer signs compositions, the jazz musician signs performances, which are engrammed in discs that can be listened again and again, and also cut in parts, recomposed, played in different volumes and speeds, etc. Through these recordings, the musician can relate to a tradition consisting of specific interpretations of a stock of standards that function as the basis of new improvisations. Such a work of art is no more the unique operatic piece described by Walter Benjamin in The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, nor is it a copy of a superior original, but it is from the start an interpretation, hence always already a repetition. In classical music, the possibilities of conserving performances and not only works was discovered especially by Glenn Gould. But on the other hand, the phonograph is also the basis of the new music industry. As Stiegler summarizes it in Les Instruments de la musique du nous, while music is always a power of synchronizing the time of consciousnesses, the new music industry extends this power further until it becomes global. Music is a particularly powerful vehicle of cultural globalization because it is not limited by linguistic frontiers. Music industry also uses this power for new objectives, for it standardizes behavior in order to enhance consumption. In Symbolic Misery 2, Stiegler adopts Jeremy Rifkin's description of the present hyper-industrial context, and I'm quoting. Jeremy Rifkin has rightly argued that we are living in the era of cultural capitalism. Because it allows for the separation of producers and consumers, the machinic systemization of all forms of symbolic and sensible expressions is able to put all kinds of aesthetic spheres into the service not only of social control, but also of control societies, where it is a matter of capturing the attention of souls so as to control the behavior of bodies, with the intention of getting them to consume goods and services, end of quote. According to Stiegler, in traditional places of worship, music synchronized consciousnesses in such a way that individual diachronization remained possible. But in a consumer society, individual diachronization is quite simply eliminated, so that the difference between the I and the we disappears and melts into the general, the they, le das man. This is the present situation of aesthetic capitalism, in which all ears are submitted to formatting by industrially produced retentional dispositives in a way that pushes individuals towards an increasing desindividualization. In the case of music, this means being submitted to passively listening to or hearing several hours of music per day without being able to select and actively produce the music one is exposed to. Even though art world seems to provide hyper-idiomatic reactions to this, Stiegler is not sure if this constitutes genuine objections to the present situation or just its dialectical modulations. And now, to end, I will speak about hearing aids, so to say. According to Stiegler, in our epoch, industrially produced and distributed music is one of the central modes of aesthetic war that capitalism wages on everybody, while extinguishing the desire and thereby engendering a symbolic misery. This is his well-known thesis. However, it seems to me that music is also his most developed example for new kinds of openings, because, as he says, music is by nature addiction and desire, but positive addiction, end of quote. All musical organologies are techniques for synchronizing souls. Not only 20th century totalitarianism and 21st century capitalism, but all musical organologies possess the capacity of turning individuals into a mindless crowd. However, all of them provide also possibilities of active listening and invention. Discovering active listening practices today does not only mean reviving amateur practices, but really thinking through the new organological context of music. In the article Le circuit du désir musical, l'interprète, le compositeur, l'auditeur, organe et instrument, Stiegler shows what such an active relation to music could be today. In this text, his demonstration takes the form of a deconstruction of the opposition between composer and the interpreter in the context of the Western learned music, say from Monteverdi to Hector Parra and Olga Neuwirth. To start with, he underlines that the supposed opposition between the composer who creates and the instrumentist who only interprets is false. Evidently, every composer works by interpreting existing secondary and tertiary retentions, including the available instruments, what he calls lutherie. I don't have a better translation. And every instrumentist interprets the work instead of just reproducing it. But much more essentially, both are firstly and foremostly musicians, that is, persons who hear. I quote, "A musician is somebody who first of all hears, entend. That is to say, she's primarily affected by the ear which has also eyes and hands and a body that connects them. She cannot limit herself to calculating. She can calculate, she must calculate, but if she does this, it is only in order to give to hear what she has heard herself and which is incalculable. This is inscribed in a circuit of desire, which is constituted as a web of exclamations." End of quote. What the musician hears is, of course, the stock of the pre-individual musical experiences that constitute her musical culture. But it is also all kinds of other effects that need not have anything to do with music. A person, a work of art, finally, any echo of the world in which she lives. Such primary affections constitute the ear of the musician. I quote, "The composer has an auditory organ or an auditory apparatus which needs to translate itself into the form of exclamation. That is to say, she needs to spatialize and temporalize her listening in such a way that it becomes immediately a writing." End of quote. She uses the available pre-individual stock in order to play with the auditor's horizon of expectations, while trying to produce something unexpected. The interpreter, for her part, does not simply reproduce the score, but repeats the composer's listening, as well as her own listening that arranges and deranges the score. Without interpretation, music is only virtual. It suffers from a lack of being. It does not exist without this interpretative exclamation, which can also become a writing, for instance, on a disc. Music is really a tissue of retentions in which the composer and the interpreter can hear a default, to which both of them need to answer, but that also shows their respective defaults. And finally, the contemporary auditor, who can very well ignore how one writes and plays music, but also be an active part of the musical event. Stiegler reminds that the auditor does not only hear a concert, but also judges and interprets her own act of listening, and today even repeats it. Indeed, the emergence of recording technologies that first seemed to detach listeners from musical practice has led to new forms of participation, to music making, and to new musical practices as well. Some of them are born when musical engrams become means of active listening, like Miles Davis's work with discs, or classical music amateurs' practices of studying and annotating scores, performances, and recordings. But there are also more and more musical technologies that enable an even more active relation to recordings. In Prologue with Chorus, Stiegler mentions musical amateurs whose practices open new possibilities of listening, such as himself in his jazz aficionado period, and today's samplers and turntablers. But also pioneers of electronic music, such as Karl-Heinz Stockhausen and Jacek Xenakis, as well as work done in avant-garde research organizations, such as precisely IRCAM. Stiegler underlines that music takes place as tertiary retentions, which are not only scores, nor only instruments, but also recordings, concert halls, systems of distribution, dispositives of formation of ears, such as radios, conservatories, institutions of programming. Together, all of this constitutes the techniques that format sensibility and push towards a politics of the sensible life of souls and bodies. When these politics are reduced to politics of control, they can numb sensibility. But politics of sensibility can also become active aesthetic judgment. One mode of such an aesthetic judgment takes form when the machinic epoch gives rise to sensibility's machinic turn, in which sensibility is reconfigured, imagination is stimulated, and new forms of imagination can take place. And it is not only a theoretical possibility, it is an active practice of innumerable professional and amateur musicians. They give evidence of a desire of music that consists in a circuit of exclamations of composers, instrumentists, auditors, and other active listeners. It seems to me that in Stiegler's thinking, the desire of music that turns in this circuit has a particularly great potentiality of short-circuiting the extinction of desire, not because it should always circulate better symbols than the others, the ones that push towards the symbolic misery, but because whatever circulates rises from desire of music. Stiegler says, I quote, "Music is addiction and desire, but positive addiction. Real music, if you can say acting music, is a practice of putting out of control, even by the very institutions and dispositives that make of a music a dispositive of control." End of quote. Music, therefore, realizes an economy of gift that short circuits the closed economy of the capital because it constantly gives more than it has and gives what it does not have, like Derrida said of the gift. And this is why music is Stiegler's true love. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Susanna, for this wonderful talk, especially on a subject that is, according to me, very, very much under-researched. So it's very wonderful to listen to your talk. So we will have time for some conversations, and then at the same time, the audience could also raise questions. I think there is a Q&A session, and you are able to post your questions there. So I'm very impressed by the very beginning when you said that in this interview that Stiegler did, Le Cercle du Désir musical, that was actually, I think that was actually conducted in 2004, but that's to say almost 20 years ago. And where he said he wanted to do the same thing to, like what Derrida did to writing. So I'm also wondering if let's consider the fact that it was said in 2004. That was it still the kind of a project of Stiegler? Because you at the very beginning also said that you were working on another paper on cinema. And I'm sure that you know there's an article by Stiegler called Archi-Cinema. The Archi-Cinema is something in contrast to the Archi-writing of Derrida. Yeah. And his later critique of the construction. It seems to me that there has some change. Maybe we can say, in his project on music. And I think that is very much that could be contrasted with what Derrida was trying to do in grammatology, and what Stiegler was trying to do to analyze it through what he called a grammatization. not through Derrida, but through Hu, the Susanna Hu, the linguist. And if we can say that in the grammatology, what Derrida was trying to do is to juxtapose, for example, Hegel and Leibniz, alphabetical writing, phonetic writing, and pictorial writing. What Stiegler was trying to do maybe is not horizontal, but rather something vertical. That's to say, to expose the history of the supplement. And the history of the supplement is that opens to the question of different forms of writing, the literal writing, analog writing, and digital writing. So basically we see that what he was trying to show is a history of writing, and how this history of writing, especially in the digital form of writing, reconstitutes, but actually not only the digital, but as you mentioned, with the phonograph, for example, and the analog writing, that already reconstitutes the relation between music, between listening and music. So because you are writing something on the cinema, so I'm curious if you take this, this gap, this 20 years into account of his projects on music.
That was a lot of very good questions. I will miss some of them, I'm sure. There is, first of all, the question of Stiegler's relation to Derrida, Stiegler's relation to cinema also, and then this historicity that all of this technical support bring in. And in 20 years, of course, a lot of things have happened. So I start by Derrida, maybe. And I really think that Stiegler is decisively Derrida's son, his intellectual son. He's really continuing this project of deconstruction and grammatology, but he's interested in sensibility. So where Derrida is somehow deconstructing the logos, the rational part of writing, the meaning part of writing, what Stiegler is working on for me is really the sensibility, and in this case the sound, but also of course in the case of cinema, the vision. And these two senses are really what make up the sensitivity for him. And it's sometimes I think that both of them actually could be explained through Kant. So you have Kant and you first critique, you have these conditions of sensibility and conditions of understanding. Derrida is working on the conditions of understanding and he makes a wonderful work on that. And then comes Stiegler and says, well, I'll take the sensibility part. So I have time and I have space, time that would be music and space that would be, first of all, the photo. And cinema then is the combination of all of this. And as you know, he has this very wonderful way of saying that only these technological means of photograph, and then cinema allow us to think about the consciousness, this Kantian consciousness, in terms of a cinema, of a recording. But it was always already that way. It just becomes visible now thanks to this technology. So this is maybe how I see his relation with Derrida. He's really very close, but then he's opening another door that Derrida, frankly, leaves aside. Derrida is not as bodily, so to say. Senses are not there. But in this work, I would say that there's another Derrida student who is important as well, and that's Peter Szendi. Because Peter Szendi is this, he's also doing a deconstruction, and really he's also a musicologist, and he was starting from musical works of notations and discs and everything possible. And they work together in IRCAM, both of them. So Stiegler and Szendi knew one another, and I'm sure that Stiegler, with his way of learning from people, also learns things from Szendi, who's a trained musicologist. Everybody in IRCAM. So this is one part. Now that was the Derrida part, sort of a extended one. Then concerning cinema and music, I already started a little bit. I think that what Stiegler is really interested in is cinema, because he says that cinema, that's consciousness. But in order to speak about cinema, so he divides the job between the spatial space and time, spatial images, temporal music, and that he analyzes them separately. And music is extremely important because it gives the temporality of consciousness as well. But I think that in the end, you should really look at cinema in order to understand what he means about consciousness, not only music. However, I'm really interested in this musical part because I think that in music, Stiegler really found emancipatory things, a lot of emancipation, and he clearly found joy, happiness. This is why I say Stiegler's love of music. Whereas his readings of cinema, he's always a little bit, well, they don't touch me as much as being really aficionado readings. For me, music is more important. And well, I don't know him well enough as a person to know what this feeling translates, but this is my feeling nonetheless, that music is really the thing. And then the 20 years passed. So it's true that what Stiegler is doing and what Derrida is not doing is also this history of technological supports, of grammatology, of thinking, of memory. And 20 years ago, well, actually, he knew more than we would think, precisely because he was in IRCAM. And IRCAM, that's a place where they were experimenting with all kinds of very interesting technologies that nobody knows about, but they are really, really very interested in this technological part also, and not only about the musical part that results from them. So maybe there was quite a lot of things already. But then, of course, what appears to us now is that he's very interested in analogical technologies after all. So photo, the recording and all of that, that's analogical. But what we have today is, of course, synthetical technologies that we have with the digital means. And he doesn't venture very far into that, but of course, this points at it and says that it's tremendously important. So what we have now, what we should do now is really to extend all of this to synthetic images made by digital means. And there's no limits, really. We have enormous amounts of possibilities. There, I had a long answer to a long question. I hope I took the essential.
Yeah, well, it's right. Thank you very much. Yeah, I mean, the reason I asked is because he has a Cinema article, and I think that kind of he replaced writing with cinema in that sense. But it's of course, you know, music has a very important role for him, because he was a listener of jazz music. He has this bar restaurant in Toulouse, and before IRCAM, he was also the sous-director of INA, institute, national institutes dedicated to audiovisual material. So he was already doing a lot of digitization work before he became director of IRCAM. That was actually strongly supported by Pierre Boulez, as you have mentioned earlier. And I think maybe the key to the question of music, or why you feel that music is essential for his thought. I mean, even maybe in comparison with cinema, maybe is the notion of the instrument.
Mm.
Of course, you know, with cinema, we can talk about instrument, we can talk about apparatus, but I think the musical instrument is something quite. But music, let's say the concept of instrument has two significance. At least one is that takes him to what he called organology. You know? So because now when people, you know, when he talked about general organology, there was association with Georges Canguilhem, because in his 1947 essay, machine organism, where he evoked that in Bergson there was 1907 creative evolution. There was already a general organology, but Stiegler's general organology didn't come from Canguilhem, but from organology in music. So one thing, and the other thing is the difference, I think, that you already made. That's to say, tour and instrument. So a tour, like a hammer, like a simple tour, and the instruments. There is a fundamental difference between them, and the instrument is the musician through the instruments can repeat the same practice, and that also allows to. It is through the repetition that it takes the musician to another place, from the calculable to the incalculable, in that sense, and that opened the question of the amateur. Maybe you can say so. In that sense, I think that music is indeed fundamental to think about that. He always repeat the story that Roland Barthes says that if you want to understand Schumann, you have to play the piano. You cannot understand Schumann by just listening to orchestra or listening to MP3. You have to practice piano. So something quite fundamental regarding music, I think. There is another question that I want to discuss with you, is about political music and political listening. Now you're trying to show that there is an analogy, if you can say in this way, there is an analogy between music and ethos. It's because he tried to associate the concept of individuation, psychic and collective individuation, with what the Greeks called ethos, which for him composes two parts, decay or justice, and idols, shame. So we have justice, we have shame, being ashamed. And the question of idols is particularly important because for that one has to make a distinction between shame and guilt. I remember we had this strange discussion on the bus. I think it was 2008, and was on a bus. I met him by accident in a bus. And then he asked me on the bus, what do you think is the difference between shame and guilt? And later, many years later, when he says, that Freud used guilt to, to describe the Oedipus complex, and it is catastrophe in a way, because for the Greeks, it was not guilt, it was shame that was at play. But it is precisely these two notions, decay, justice, and idols, exist, or maybe were sent by Jews through Hermex into the polis that constitutes a collective life, which is the Greek polis. And he drew an analogy, if we can use this word, analogy between the Greek ethos and music. So we see there is a parallelism, but at the same time, as we know that this collective life of the Greeks also collapsed at a moment in history, and you are a specialist of Hegel. You know, that was the whole project of the Grundlinie der Philosophie des Rechts, you know, that to address this decline of the collective life and the rise of individualism in modern society, in the Neuzeit, for example. So inevitably, you know, this ethos was challenged in the modern time, and even more in the contemporary society, when individualism in the form of consumerism, or consumerism in the form of individualism dominates. So what, I mean, I'm curious, what would you think about the kind of new possibility to, or new way of articulating the question of music in regard of the decline of the ethos in the sense of the Greeks, and probably that is also a response to a question that you raised, you know, after the 20th century totalitarianism or totalizing state, and the 21st century capitalism. So I'm just curious, you know, how you read it, and especially your expertise of Hegel and your work on Hegel and Heidegger.
Once again, how tremendously good questions. So I'm going to follow the thread and see where I arrive. First of all, I want to come just a little bit back to the question of the difference between tool and instrument, because this instrumentality of the musical instrument is very important for Stiegler, precisely because it shows the instrumentality of the person as well. So it's not just that there is a person who has these instruments that he can use them, he has to learn to use them. And the entire life, actually, of a musician is an never-ending practice of the same instrument. So if a musician stops practicing, even a good one, well, the music making is over, and it will never be over. So it's really something very fascinating, this kind of a musical cyborg you make, or a musical medium that has to exist in order for music to exist. So there is necessarily this connection between the human being who practices and then the instrument who is being practiced. Both form both. And even in song, it's the same thing. So a singing voice is not our ordinary voice, it's a trained voice. It has a very specific way of resounding in us. So this is there is no natural state of music, so to say. So this is why the instrumentality of music is so important, and it's a very important example for Stiegler. But then the political question, which is huge and extremely interesting, of course. So all of this starts by Plato, and really the interest of music ever since Plato, and in this long line of discussion that includes Plato, Rousseau, Hegel, actually, Nietzsche, Lacoue-Labarthe very much, and even Heidegger at some point, consists in saying that, well, you need musical terms in order to speak about collective effects. At the moment when a political community is purely effective, there is something like a collective enthusiasm or collective fear or collective something like that, but you can't reason. You can't reason a mob, so to say. You can't reason a feeling of, I don't know, patriotism or revolution or whatever. There are feelings that are unreasonable, but you can describe them thanks to music. And this is also something that has always been known by the most clever politicians. You can also give form to this kind of a crowd by music. And this is something that Wagner knew very well. Wagner has become really the picture of the musician who creates this Wagnerian crowd, which then becomes this crowd of German people and so on. It has been used in very horrible manners as well. I don't blame Wagner for that. It was not his fault, but this is the phenomenon that he brought forth and understood very well and used. So why this is the first step, so to say, in this in this juxtaposition between ethos and music, it is because music is the best image there is for this kind of a common tuning, which is not irrational. It is something else than irrational, but you can't turn it into rationality either. It's something between, and only music can explain that, of pure effectivity. And then we come to this question, very good question of the difference between the Greeks and now, maybe, where in the Greeks, they would have spoken about this affectivity in terms of dike and eidos. Indeed, dike, would that be the, what is its musical translation? Stiegler doesn't say it, so I have to improvise. It would be something like, for instance, the scale. You have Dorian or Microlydian or whatever kind of a scale, and there is something like a law of good music that Plato was so eager about. And if you are a good person, you will respond to it and withdraw with shame in front of the bad scales. Maybe something like that. But what happens with the eidos is that you have shame before law, you have shame before God, you have shame before others if you have failed them. So this is the Greek way of doing it. But what we have, it's indeed a good question. What is the difference between this Greek shame and our guilt? What is this Schuldigsein that characterizes modernity, and what is that? And I would say that the difference is that the dike you have before the God, before others, but Schuldigsein you also have before yourself. This is where this kind of an internal self-reflection starts, and you listen to yourself listening, you sing to yourself singing, you somehow not only follow the wave of musical enthusiasm, but you listen to yourself following and you judge yourself constantly. And there is something that has happened because of this, but it's very difficult to explain it really. And for some reason, and this is another fantasy that comes to my mind, it makes me think about Bach and the choirs of, I don't know, one of his passion music. So the entire community sings together and they cry together so much and they are in despair together. But there is something of this very elaborated kind of singing that comes to my mind when speaking about the Schuld, the guilt. Although I don't think that singing as such is guilty, of course, but it's a way of listening to yourself. It's a way of listening to yourself and making your soul somehow, I don't know, visible, maybe audible, sensible somewhere. So these are not the very good answers to history of music in terms of history of politics. That's really difficult, but it's also very, very interesting. It should be done by someone.
Yeah, right. I think that that maybe because I didn't really work on the question of music. So, but I suppose there is, or in the writing of Stiegler, there is there is maybe a new notion of democracy that we can find through his writing on music and on cinema, for example, especially through the figure of the amateur, through the figure of the amateur, and that the discourse on the amateur may single it out from a general discourse on collectivity. And that may give a new politics, as we know that the late Stiegler was very much into the question of knowledge, the question of learning, the relation between savoir-faire and savoir-vivre. The last time we also discussed with Jean-Luc Barthélemy here in this seminar series. We have some questions, but I just have one last point that I would like to discuss with you, and that is also related to the question of the amateur, is the question of the lack, of the default, and the question of desire. Now, the reason I want to talk about this is that because last time I think that we had a discussion on this question of the desire with Jean-Luc Barthélemy, and I had to defend Stiegler because I think that Jean-Luc had not understood completely what Stiegler want to say about desire and the question of the lack here, because I think that the question of desire, or Stiegler's concept of desire, maybe we find less, we find it in Freud, but maybe we find it more also in Plato, in the Symposium of Plato. And the Symposium is a dialogue on desire. Because the eros, it's not that the eros is beautiful, but the eros desire. The beautiful is the object of desire. And this object of desire does not exist as such. And when we say it does not exist as such, it means that it is beyond the question of subsistence and existence. Therefore, it is the question of consistence. So I remember in your talk, there was one part when you talked about the question of the lack, I don't know if I understood it correctly. What you mean by that? I think it doesn't mean the lack of capacity to play an instrument, but rather a certain kind of lack, which is to say the non-existence, or something that could not be categorized as existence, and it has to be looked upon through a plan of consistence. And I think this is the question, maybe a really fundamental question when we talk about art, and when we talk about music. The first time, a really long time ago, when he came to my office, and then he saw there was a guitar in my office. So he said, so what do you play? I said, well, I was learning some Django Reinhardt. Then he said, I wrote about Django Reinhardt. So I went to look for what he has written about Django Reinhardt. And you know that Django Reinhardt lost his two of his fingers of his left hand. And as a guitarist, he is supposed to be doomed. I mean, having a guitarist lost two fingers is, he or she should change his career. But of course, Django became a better guitarist than he was. And there is a whole theory behind that, in Bernard's writing about quasi-causality and so on. But I think that there is fundamentally the question of desire as well, and also this desire that goes beyond the question of subsistence and existence towards the construction of a plan of consistence. So that was something I had in my mind when I was listening to this quote from De la Misère symbolique that you have spoken about.
Indeed, So I think this question of democracy is indeed a very good one, an important one for Stiegler, for us all, by the way, of course. And I like the association that you make between being amateur and being in democracy, because democracy is, of course, the regime of those who don't have the competency of governing. They are incompetent, but they love it. And this is one of the good definitions of democracy. It also comes from Rancière, who says that democracy is the system of those who don't have the who don't have the competence, who don't have the skill to govern, and who nonetheless want to govern because they have the love of their community, because they have the love of the common thing. And in this sense, democracy is the rule of amateurs. And you should forget about the old nasty Greek way of saying that it's the rule of the mob, also the move of the rubble. That's not the case. It's the rule of those who don't know but want to learn. And precisely because they don't want, they can learn. And this is something then that you indeed put it very well, is a kind of a lack indeed that becomes very important in music and in all arts, by the way, and the lack which is not at all to be seen as a negative thing. It's on the contrary, because there is lack, that there is space for desire, there is space for invention also, and space for things like creation, because how to say, you are never a good musician if you think that you have already learned it and you have nothing else to do. A good musician is precisely the one who says that, well, I could do it quicker, I could do it more touching, I could do it, well, so and so. And it's even more obvious when you think about a composer, because a composer, of course, knows that, well, Bach and Beethoven and Mozart and Organology, they already did all of that. But then again, something is lacking. I want to do the thing that is lacking. And it's not only that something is lacking out there, but something is lacking in me as well, because I don't know how to do it. But I have to improvise, I have to find it. And this is something that comes forth when Stiegler is speaking about arts. So both music, cinema, and all of them, actually, as much as I know. So the art world is a totalitarian, sad world when this lack disappears, when somehow all lack is saturated, all senses are saturated, ears are too full, emotions are overwhelming, and there's no place anymore for invention because everything is already there. This is the, whether it is totalitarian, whether it is 24/7 capitalism, whatever the system, but this is when you transform art into mere entertainment and political tools. And each time when Stiegler shows us the way of getting out of this situation, he says that, well, you have to find your desire. You have to find your, somehow, the lack that is there and know why you don't know, but you will, you want to know. And this kind of, only the discovery of this lack enables something like individuation as well. Individuation of the musician, or an auditor, but also the individuation of a public who suddenly finds out that, hey, we are the new public of amateurs. We want to listen to new musics. We want to do new things. So this is why lack, despite its negative tone, is for him always a positive term, I would say.
Yeah, right. Thank you very much. Indeed, it is the ideal which doesn't exist as such a conditions or forms of knowledge, according to him. So thank you very much. I think I will pass. We can try to address some of the questions from the audience. Otherwise, I'm going to take up all the time, even though I would love to. But it's really some time to the audience. There are a few questions, so I'm going to, Susanna, you can find in the Q&A, but I'm also going to read out because there are some people who are on other platforms. So let me read out the first question from Mandus Riedefeld. Hi, my name is Mandus Riedefeld. I was thinking about the circumstances under which Stiegler constructed his argument around how the tertiary phonographic capture of a melody makes clear the bleed between primary and secondary retention and grounds temporality of consciousness. From what I know, he did that in prison. It seemed entirely quiet there, and this quietude was, at least according to stories in Acting Out, quite affirmed by him. Do you think this absence of listening impacts the way one poses the isomorphism between temporality in music and consciousness? In other contexts, working down the street, etc., the functional distinction between noise and melody seems quite unclear.
Yeah, very interesting to ask oneself if it needs this silence of the prison in this case in order to start thinking about sound. And I think in the interview I quoted in the very beginning, Stiegler said something like, well, I used to have a very active listening practice when I was a bar owner. And then once he got to the prison, well, that stopped. There was no music, at least. I don't know, maybe he had possibility of listening to the radio sometimes. I have no idea, I don't remember. But at least he could not do as he did before, that is to say, actively looking for discs and working on them in a very, very fanatic, almost fanatic way as aficionados do. And I'm sure that it's really important. I think probably all of us know that in order to hear, you have to have some silence from time to time. You have to break it down and then somehow ask yourself what happened when you were so listening so eagerly. So it is very possible. I think this quietude in everything we do is central. And this is also something that, in my opinion, Stiegler points out when he speaks about the, well, I put it very bluntly, a totalitarian mode of music listening, this music that is everywhere and overwhelming and never chosen by ourselves. This kind of music is precisely what destroys silence. When you don't have silence, you don't have this either. When it comes to walking down the street and hearing noises, well, he spoke about this actually already the primary retention that he was describing said that it is already selective. We are capable of selecting in our environment. We don't have something like simply pure registering of all sounds that are around us, but we interpret, we select, we always know what we hear, so that can be more or less concentrated, of course. But I would say that the noises, most of the time we don't even hear them. And then we can have the day when we really hear them, because our ear is tuned that way. And so it happens. So functional distinction between noise and melody, you call it noise when you don't select. You call it melody when you have this selection, when it's interpreted in function of something. But I don't know if this can be, this is an abstraction for the needs of the theory, but in a real listening experience, I think they are mixed very often. I don't know if that's enough.
Actually, as far as I know, that and I think he says that in Acting Out that he listened to the radio. He actually listened to the radio when he was in the prison, and he read Mallarmé almost every day. So, but I think it's probably not so much about the quiet, about the tranquility of the prison, but rather maybe you can say that that condition allows him to perform a phenomenological applique. And that is not simply about quietude, because you suspend a certain form of life, you suspend a certain way of association, for example, association between noise and melody and so on. So that was one condition for him to perform such an applique. And at certain point he said he he become disturbed when people come to visit him, because they destroy this kind of condition as well. That was what he said in Acting Out. So there is another question: what is the relationship between the laws of aesthetic participation and the laws of individuation, which music and movie cause, or what is the relationship between question of cinema in the symbolic misery volume 1 and the question of ready-made art and music in symbolic misery volume 2. So that's a very detailed reading.
Yes, so participation, so Stiegler indeed speaks about the loss of artistic participation that comes about with the new technologies, and he really underlines that this duplicitous aspect of the recording technologies and filming and cinema technologies, because they mean a loss of individuation, a loss of competencies. You don't play anymore. So people stopped playing themselves. They stopped sort of reading scores. This is why Adorno was so shocked about the new musical technologies as well. And then this is for one, Stiegler manages to find the positive side of the modernity by saying that, yeah, but you will find new kinds of new ways of listening in these technologies. So loss of individuation, yes, to start with, it is there, loss of aesthetic participation, because you lose your capacities, and this is really ingrained in modern technologies. But at the same time, you can find new ways of doing it, and this he underlines this very much. So between the symbolic misery 1 and 2, I don't know if I can remember, can answer to it now, because I have sort of forgotten what he said about voice in that text. It is important, this question of social sculpture, but it's been a couple of months and I've just forgot. Maybe Yuk remembers.
I think what he says about Joseph Beuys is that how could, for example, Beuys, through his work of art, that construct the circuit of individuation. So because like what we said about earlier about music and cinema, these are temporal objects, and these temporal objects have also an important role to play in the process of individuation, because they allow a certain kind of circuit to be formed. That's to say, the circuit of individuation. So what Beuys was doing, from when after the first volume, he did talk about the catastrophe, the aesthetic catastrophe. In the second volume, he was trying to show through the example of Joseph Beuys how a social sculpture could be a possibility to think about the role of art in the construction of the circuit of individuation. And that will be that demand a certain how to say an appropriation or reappropriation of technology, like for example what Marcel Duchamp was trying to do with the ready-made, even with his the note descending from the escalier, for example. There was one example. One example to study the appropriation of technology by artists. So, well, that's what I remember as well.
Yeah.
Then there is that is a long question, I think, from experts on music probably. So let's try to see if we can read it, probably if not entirely, partially, from Madalena Machado. Capitalism as inseparable from industrialized coloniality, racism, patriarchy and bio-class social Darwinism, and Stiegler's positive addiction to music, a privileged way towards somatic emancipation. I quote Derrida Yvonne Archimbault-Overy in her keynote, The Roomings of Colonial Phantoms. We need a way to put to rest what burns in our souls in a blend of grief, regret, sorrow, anguish, and denial. What we lost when one human culture chose to break its covenant of dignity with other human cultures, a psychic disruption that not only destroyed the cause of all human hospitality, but also calcified the human heart. The history we seek lies elsewhere within the ruins and ghosts of what could have been inside the lives of descendant survivors of your insanity. This question is addressed to both of you. However, I'm particularly interested in Yuk Hui's perspective from having lived in the Iberian Peninsula. I don't think I ever lived there. Would you consider Fado and flamenco, Lorca's naming of sonitos, negros, and the theory of play of the duende, and most especially the post-war gathering of artists avant-garde around Count Yondo was a fiesta of flamenco arts, music, song, and dance held in Granada in 1922. Duende and Saudade as Atlantic liturgies of grief coming from the slave trade and the unique complicity between monotheism of them conversion in Iberia and the foundation of colonial capitalism would explain those two African-based practices' ability to cross all borders, even though they are vernacular expressions. One example being Miles Davis being enraptured by his encounter with flamenco, and his thought on this Iberian musical influence and its manifold diasporic manifestation would be most welcome. I don't know if I understood this question enough, so I leave it to you, Susanna, if you have anything to say.
Yeah, I understood some things at least. First of all, I happen to adore flamenco. That's a coincidence, biographical coincidence, but it has nothing to do. I don't know jazz, I know flamenco. That's another world. But what is really interesting here is indeed, on the one hand, this confluence of different types of music coming from different directions. It's really a mixture of European, African, Arab, Black, and so on. Musics, it's not upper class music, though it used to become so. And it's a music in which indeed you always, well, you do it yourself. You are aficionado because you do it, you practice it. So you sing and dance and play and so. So I think the mixture between public and musician is well. There's not such a lot of difference in the beginning. So today, of course, you have spectacles, and that's another matter. But that's in the beginning, everybody who does participates. And so I don't have a good interpretation of this kind of a very deeply popular and deeply expressive, effective and political kind of music, but it makes me think about somebody else, namely Frantz Fanon. And Frantz Fanon, who wrote about, well, he wrote about slavery and colonialism and then decolonial moments. And he said that in the moment of decolonialism, what happens is that people who really don't have any other ways of expressing themselves, so they don't have education, they don't have political position, they don't have anything, they are submitted to the worst kind of violences. What remains is the body. And it's the singing and dancing and body, also body who can be violent and who needs sex. So sex, violence, music and dance are the only last modes of expression that are remaining in that kind of a situation of slavery and uttermost oppression. So I think this is a very, very telling and very important kind of remark about somehow these arts in particular, singing and dancing. Music is both. I think it's very artificial to separate dance from music. They belong together, in my opinion. So this is the last musical artistic expression you have at the moment when everything else has been taken away. And it somehow shows that it's not just a decorative art. It's not just something nice you do on Sunday when all serious work has been done, but it is a political art from the very beginning. So it's something that we don't necessarily remember when we go to a concert hall. But to start with, it is there in the, because it's in emotion and it's in the body. So I don't know if it's a good answer, but it's at least a reaction or an echo to the question as I understood it.
Right. Yeah, I think that there was one important part of this question on the what Madalena called industrialized coloniality. And I if I understood correctly, it doesn't only mean, you know, that older form of colonialization, but also, for example, how colonization or coloniality is carried out through the industrial temporal object. But maybe today we can call, you know, like we can say American pop music, for example, and that has pervaded everywhere. For so what would be the what could be the relation between if I understood correctly, the kind of local or indigenous music and this industrialized or these industrial temporal objects, and that carries the mission of consumerism, for example. A huge question. A huge
question. I can say just one tiny thing, which is a very tiny thing concerning it. Indeed, it's important. And Stiegler is really sensitive to this overwhelming presence of American pop music or American film for that matter, of course. But of course, I also think that wherever in the world and in all kinds of situations in which people live, there are always people who can take this very standardized pop music and then play it in their own manner. So as soon as you just decide to grab the means of musical production, you can also introduce a difference. You can't necessarily invent something totally different, but you can introduce a different, and that's already something. I don't know if we can really jump out of that flow of music anymore.
Or maybe what Stiegler would say, you know, given this situation, how can we appropriate or reappropriate these industrial temporal objects or the industrial technologies to do something else, or to develop a positive, to turn it into a positive pharmacon. I mean, that would be rather, you know, that might be what you would say concerning this question. And I remember we had a discussion on this, where I remember he gave a talk on this question. That was in 2019 when we were giving conference in Taipei together. That was the last time I saw him. He was trying to engage with the work of Grisson, the poet. But I couldn't enter into the details there. But thank you for this really important question. So there, maybe we can take the last question from Renzo. So Renzo asked, Stiegler mentioned that a co-individuation is not the same as individuation. It is a process of individuation. For example, in Plato's dialogues, in which you have the presence of Socrates and Gorgias, who are not in a position to individualize, to individuate. Individualize is another term, individuate. In Plato's dialogue, the goal of the dialogue is, however, to come to a kind of agreement, even an agreement to disagree. If you can say, we don't agree on that, we agree on things, we don't agree on that. It's kind of a disagreement, is this disagreement with an agreement on disagreement. In that sense, he gives us an example of reading a book as a short circuit, indicating that it may be a short circuit if you think you are reading a book and in fact you do not read it. It is a long circuit if you individuate by reading the book, if you are in the process of individuating yourself. In that sense, with the digital technologies in music today, or the so-called new field recordings and sound are current operates in a process of individuation or co-individuation. What do you think about it? And thank you for your beautiful lecture about Stiegler and music.
Thank you for the thank you. I would really love to know what Stiegler would have said about the new sound art currents and things that are being done now in the art of the really experimental music, because there are so fascinating, thrilling things being done all over. So also pieces in which music and image and visual and even tactile and all of that are somehow mixed. You don't necessarily make the difference between sound and vision anymore. This I would love to know. I think, however, for my part, that these projects are always somehow co-individuation. So individuation happens thanks to, it never happens alone, in my opinion. So it always happens together with something. This is my understanding of this term. And so sometimes it's together with somebody else, is somebody who is indeed really present. And for instance, people who make together a work of music do this. But it can also be you with a recording, for instance, and still through recording other people are there. You are never really alone. So I would say that it's always also a co-individuation. It's a question of what you pay attention to each time. And when it is an active, real process of co-individuation, you do not become one. Indeed, there is place for disagreement. In this case, there might be space for disagreement of what is good music, what is beautiful. Yeah, that as well. And this I find very important. But yeah, I think that my main answer would be that this common aspect is primordial here, and also that you hardly make music alone, even though you think you do. I think it's always somehow common. I would say so.
Right. Yeah, thank you, Susanna, for the answer to this question. I just wanted to add one point: is that you know, when you read the book, you don't really individuate with the book. You individuate with the author of the book. When you are looking at the artwork, you are not individuating with the artwork. You are individuating with the artist who creates the artwork. The artwork. So here is that the work of art, be it music or cinema, has the possibility to create a lone circuit. The condition of a lone circuit is actually the lone circuit actually start with disagreement. Disagreement or incompatibility, if we follow the vocabulary of Simondon. So therefore, you know, in Plato's dialogue, you know, there is Socrates always trying to problematize the argument and then to how to arrive at at a kind of individuation, we can say, because that always start with a disagreement or with a different opinion in order to arrive at that. So I suppose that it's possible to use digital technology in the music today to create this kind of new this long circuit. Actually, many years ago, there was with Stiegler, when we were in Berlin, we met a young student, François. I don't know where he is now. And François spent, every week in a club called the Bergheim in Berlin, next to the Ostbahnhof, the most famous nightclub in Berlin. Mm-hmm. And François tried to explain to Stiegler that it is in Bergheim that he can find the model of European democracy of the 20th century. So he has been trying to seduce Stiegler to go to Bergheim with him together, to experience techno music. And Bernard didn't go, of course. But he was a bit. He was moved by this seduction. So I suppose I believe that there is the possibilities to think in that way, but it still has to be experimented. And we still have to think together. So I think we have finished all the questions, I suppose. So and let's see if anyone leaves on the chat. No, there's no other questions. So thank you very much, Susanna. And I also want to thank everyone for being here with us. So thank you. And Susanna, we will be in touch again. And have a nice day.
Thank you, everybody, and have a nice evening, I think, on your side of the globe. Nice to meet you, and hopefully next time in live.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye-bye.